My name is Apoorva Mandavilli. I'm a reporter with the New York Times, where I cover science and global health. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here, despite the 34 hours it took me to get here. And today we'll be talking about pandemic therapeutics and pandemics in general. And I think it's fair to say that before COVID-19, most people in the general public spent very little time thinking about pandemics. And after COVID-19, they probably don't want to ever think about it ever again. But the people on this stage spend a lot of time thinking about pandemics and thinking about how we can prepare for them and how we can fight them. And, what we think about when we think about pandemics, I think everybody would say vaccines were amazing, but we haven't really spent that much time thinking about therapeutics. And the people on this panel also know what kinds of pathogens are coming our way. COVID-19 divided this world. It made us more polarized. It created more mistrust. But I think it also created opportunities because it showed us where the fault lines are, where more research is needed, what sort of collaborations are needed, like that more therapeutics are needed and not just vaccines. And so hopefully that's what we'll talk about in this panel today, looking to the future, to what is needed, what sort of research is needed. And our panelists, we are very lucky to have some of the best minds in this field to walk us through this. Let me introduce them to you. I'll start with Dr. Nanshan Zhong, right on my left. He is the director of the National Clinical Research Center for Respiratory Diseases at Guangzhou Laboratory. Then we have Professor David Ho. He is the professor of microbiology and immunology at Columbia University. Professor Sharon Lewin, we've been hearing a lot about. She's the director of the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity at the Cumming Global Centre and the Cumming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics. And we have Professor Linfa Wang, who is the director of the Emerging Infectious Diseases Program at Duke-NUS Medical School. So, panelists, I'd like to begin with one very sort of direct question. I'd like each of you to spend just 1 minute telling me and telling our audience here, what is the one thing you took away from the response to the COVID-19 pandemic? Much as we don't want to think about that, I think it did tell us some important lessons. So what was the most important lesson that you took away from the pandemic? Just 1 minute each, please. I'll start with you, Professor Wang.
To me, I was involved in SARS-1 and SARS-2, so to me is that the technology has advanced in the 17 years, but the geopolitics and the difficulty in handling information. So the lesson is that science alone cannot really solve all the challenges for pandemics, and we need to do better to be more holistic, Yeah, so that's my biggest lesson, is to say we did well, but we could have done much better if we also pay attention to the non-scientific issues in pandemic preparedness.
I'm going to try and not repeat anything other panelists say, but I think the one thing that we need to take away from COVID was that speed matters, and that countries that responded very quickly in COVID-19 generally did well, at least certainly in saving lives. And there's a wonderful quote from Helen Clark, who did a big review of the pandemic response a few years ago now, and she said, February 2020 was a lost month. So February 2020 was really when we had to be mobilizing on every front that we had at the time. So I think speed is really important, and we've got to think very carefully about how we can mobilize very quickly, because that first month makes a very big difference on how far things spread.
For me, I think the pandemic taught us that we could develop vaccines and antibody therapeutics within 9 months. And that's quite remarkable, since such developments in prior years took many years, 8 to 15 years. So we could do it, but it also taught me that we were ill-prepared on several fronts. And the other lesson is that we need to convey our messages better, so that we don't have this polarized situation around the world, where I would guess maybe half of the population now don't want to hear anything about pandemics, yet they remain a serious threat.
Having the two COVID experience in 2003 and 2020. And then I've all experienced for those two events. So I think that this last 20 years, we make a great effort to get quickly recognize that kind of pathogen as very dangerous for human-to-human infection, and then can quickly detect as compared with 20 years ago. And my hope, maybe next 10 years or some, pandemic will not happen. Perhaps a local epidemic will have more. Pandemic, I think that will depend on all the people in every country has had this experience, about 4 years COVID-19 experience, a very painful experience in social economy and stability. So I think my hope is that in the future, there will not be the pandemic happening.
I hope you're right. But let's go back to the point that Professor Lewin made. You said speed is really of the essence, but for governments to move quickly, there needs to be a lot of infrastructure and there needs to be a lot of funding. And that's not necessarily what we've seen from a lot of governments after COVID. Some, yes, some have leaned into it, but several have pulled away and don't want to even think about pandemics. So what do you see as the global landscape in terms of funding? What are you seeing in terms of governments? And actually, all of you can answer this question for your own governments and also those around you. What are you seeing in terms of where people are actually putting in investment?
Yeah, well, I think in brief, I see great diversity in the response, with some countries leaning in significantly with investments, and they did that early, and others continuing to invest, and others just wanting to move ahead and pretend it didn't happen. No country in particular, David and Apoorva. But within Australia, I think in Australia, I'll just talk to Australia because I think Singapore and China and the US have very interesting stories to tell. But Australia, we're a federation. So we have public health is looked after at the state level, but health is still important, and border control, etc., vaccine choice, drug funding is at the Commonwealth level. And so in Australia, our biggest commitment to the response happened very early. So in 2020, Victoria was the only state in the country that had COVID transmission. And the Victorian government leaned into that very quickly and announced funding for what you've heard about, the Australian Institute for Infectious Diseases, in October 2020, before we even had a vaccine. So I think that's quite extraordinary. And then in 2021, the Victorian government and the federal government realised that we didn't have mRNA capabilities in Australia, and therefore we were down the queue in getting access to mRNA vaccines. And many states and the federal government and the Victorian government invested in getting mRNA capabilities here, the headquarters of Moderna, BioNTech, mRNA Victoria to drive the science, and similar efforts in other states. And that all happened very, very early in the pandemic. And the final thing that's happened in Australia is that the federal government is committed to establish a Centres for Disease Control. And what the CDC will look like will be very different to the CDC in China or the US, but they want to try and solve the problem of a single respected voice that's independent of government, not easy to do, and also the issue of data integration. And that commitment also came sort of in the middle of the pandemic. So I think we were lucky in Australia that we had a state government that lent in. We're very, very worried about COVID, and a federal government. But going forward, it's a struggle. Other things. There are many health problems we need. We're cancer, cardiovascular disease, aging, dementia. These are they're all challenges for governments to fund. I think we benefited here because of that early response.
Professor Wang?
Yes. For me, I think, Singapore government is very pragmatic, so very early on, during COVID, they already see that the research we do in the infectious disease area was not geared towards large pandemic preparedness. So that in early 2021, we're still worried about, the lockdowns. The government already see that. So they established this new sort of funding for prepare. So, and when I have a chance to talk to government, we have the terminology now, pandemic preparedness. Some people like to say pandemic readiness. I think we should try to even lift that to pandemic defense. Because I view that military defense has very similar nature to pandemic defense. It's totally unpredictable, but the consequence is huge. And also, in terms of investment return, you have to use a different way to really measure that. So I'm playing that role, talk to politicians in Singapore, but Singapore politicians are very proactive. So we have 4 major programs, already. Prepare is one, upstream research. Downstream, we'll have PrepareVax, and we have NATI, the mRNA technology, nucleic acid technology, and we have NOBA. So 4 national programs, all over, hundreds, millions the investigation. And the challenge now is sustainability, because that's what I try to really say. You see the investment in military defense. If we can use the same kind of measurement, then the pandemic defense is really worthwhile investment.
I mean, I appreciate the philosophy there, and I think COVID did show us that global security is just as important, global health security is just as important. But are you really seeing governments take it seriously in the same vein that it is something that requires that same kind of investment?
In Singapore, definitely. When I was appointed as the inaugural executive director for the organization, I made it clear that if you give us a 3 or 5 years funding, like the grant, normal research grant, I say I would not be interested to take that position. It has to be a defense type of block funding. So we still review every 5 years, but at least in the foreseeable future, government is committed.
That's a very bold move, Professor Ho.
Unfortunately, my country is going in a very different direction. I try to answer your question in a very general way. I think there's a perfect storm forming. There's an assault on universities. There's an assault on science and technology, and particularly its infrastructure that was built up over many decades since World War II. And that's what made NIH, NSF, CDC, FDA, and that infrastructure allow for lots of innovation and led to the innovation economy that propelled my country forward. And now that's not only being ignored, it's being torn down systematically for reasons that are totally unclear to me. And that is sad to see. There's a third element, and that is the element of anti-immigrant sentiment. And perhaps most citizens in my country do not know that the scientific enterprise is largely staffed by foreign scientists. And when you have this anti-immigrant sentiment, you're driving away talent. And America has an advantage. I said the country. I try not to say the country. Slip of the tongue. Well, since I said it, America had been in a position to attract the best from the entire world. Very few other countries could do the same. And now that balance is being threatened seriously. So these assaults converge in a perfect storm. And the pandemic certainly did not help with the policies. And so I am really saddened by what's happening. And people don't want to talk about future pandemics when they are real threats, and perhaps even greater threats than certain military conflict, as Linfa said. And so I don't know what to do as a scientist except to speak up. And hopefully the scientific community could galvanize and vocalize and fight back to a large extent. I'm not sure I answer your question specifically, but that's where I see U.S. is going.
We'll definitely talk more about what's happening in the US and its impact, because I think it does really matter. But let's hear from Professor Zhong also about what's happening in China.
I think the in 2020, I think the COVID-19 so started in Wuhan. That's at least epidemic happening. So at that time, so China suffered a lot. So during these few years, I think the government had paid more attention that experienced such a big painful experience. They had invest a large funding to support this kind of anti-pandemic action. First, to rebuild the infrastructure of CDC. Now it's a new kind of CDC setting up. And also, I think in September 1990 and 2020, I wrote a letter to President Xi Jinping and asking whether we can set up a national laboratory to support this work. And from the very early beginning to find out the most risk pathogen and the virology, ecology, and try to prevent them from spreading. And then trying to getting that faster in testing and diagnosing and work out some drugs and vaccines. So that's get approval. That's why now the Guangzhou National Laboratory and it have been setting up. And then now been working in this field, especially. Of course, it's not only for this laboratory, and also just to coordinate the different field enterprises and universities and institute to join together to in order to try to get it to trying to find it earlier, and then as early as possible, and then to the management and therapeutics, all the things. So I think now I pay more attention to that. Still, the so-called life superiority. By this way, I think the government had done something right.
Thank you. Actually, I want to go back to something that you said, Professor Ho, which is that vaccines and therapeutics were developed really quickly during the pandemic. And that's certainly true for vaccines. I think the fastest vaccines had been developed before that was 4 years. I think this was for mumps. So that was miraculous for sure. But therapeutics did lag behind. It took a little bit longer to get them. And the investment in therapeutics was also a lot lower than it was for vaccines. And Professor Lewin, you're nodding. Why was that? Why was there so much less attention paid to therapeutics? And also, let me play devil's advocate here and say, do we really need them? If we can have mRNA vaccines in 9 months, how important is it to have therapeutics?
So this is directed to me first. Well, there are some therapeutics that would develop very quickly, and those are antibody therapeutics. So those were already available by late 2020. And you will recall the president at the time got COVID and was hypoxic and received those therapeutic antibodies. But if you're referring to small molecule therapeutics, they came later, although still much faster than traditional timeline. And that, I think, is just the process of discovery. The antibodies we could isolate and quickly, screen them, pick the ones, and go. And the manufacturing process is now very fast. And in addition, there are now technologies where we don't even have to manufacture them in companies. We could try to express them in vivo.
But they're still prohibitively expensive, correct?
Correct. But the small molecule discovery process, there's a lot of iteration of the chemistry, and that takes time. You could find a hit, but you have to, if you have a micromolar hit, it's not a drug. They want to get it to nanomolar compounds, and that takes serial iterations and therefore slower. But Paxlovid, as an example, came pretty fast by traditional timeline, although lagging behind substantially vaccines and antibody therapeutics.
But given that lag, Professor Lewin, why is it so important to develop them?
Just to add to what David said, therapeutics have generally been highly specific, one virus, one drug. And the vaccine world before COVID started to think about platform technologies that could be rapidly adapted to something new. And in fact, there was a big investment in that thinking by an organisation called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. And they funded technologies before the pandemic that could prove they could rapidly adapt to disease X, so something new. And I think that thinking hasn't been as strong in the therapeutic domain. Small molecules that David mentioned have been unbelievably brilliant for viruses such as HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, but they're all chronic infections. They took a long time to develop, and we had a bit of time up our sleeve. But with an acute respiratory infection that spreads widely, can make you very sick very quickly, you've got to intervene faster. And I think they're important for two main reasons. First, even with a great vaccine, you can still get infected, and even if you get infected, you can still get very sick. So therapeutics could potentially interfere with that. But I think the real thing that we need to think about is a possibility where we cannot develop a vaccine. And of course, that's the exact position we are still in with HIV 40 years later. But the whole pandemic of HIV turned around because of antiviral drugs. So imagine acute respiratory infectious disease that's got a high mortality, spreading widely, and we can't develop a vaccine fast. So as now Jeff talks about, it's sort of the second layer of protection, or the second fire department that you still need. And the technologies to make this adaptable to some new pathogen are actually really quite difficult, but we need to start thinking a bit more like that.
Yes, I agree with David, your point. So I think vaccine is not the first step to be considered. So as you know, if you work out some vaccine, it takes time, take money, and you need to deal with the majority, a big group of people. If the patient is not big enough, no enterprises would be interesting to develop vaccine. That's real. So I think I will agree, David thinks. I think at the moment in my country and in my laboratory, the antibody will be the first. Although antibody, so as a non-specific, but as a whole, I think now we have already had some medication, method, technology to have a broad spectrum antibody, and then to get it quickly. And this time, so we develop antibody, I think that 2021, Linfa, is that right? Linfa? Linchi? Is that right? 2021. And I saved about 800 to 900 people at that time. That's useful for alpha, beta, even delta, but not effective for Omicron and some others. But this is the faster. And then if the outbreak is still spreading, we're thinking about vaccine and small molecule drugs and so on. So vaccine is not the first step we are considering.
Yeah, so I can come different angle. I don't work on therapeutics myself, I have to declare, but as an ED of a prepared program in Singapore, we have been really discussing this therapeutics until today. The experts and people in the audience thinking of therapeutics only as treatment, reduce symptoms, save lives. But COVID taught us lesson, and in HIV, they're leading it, right? So initially it was treating disease and save lives. But now, Sharon, the experts are here. If you use at a high-risk group, you can prevent infection or dampen the transmission. So the more I'm thinking about, in the same line as antibodies, but also small molecules. Today we're already talking about broad spectrum, It would not be virus specific. When disease X comes, you have to be very lucky disease X is something you have a drug that specifically target disease X. But if you can reduce the disease X replication, not only save lives and also reduce the symptom of the people infected, but if you apply this, you can dampen the transmission. And as Sharon says, the first few weeks is critical. So if we have this, so I think, Jeff, the Cumming Center, our challenge you guys go above therapeutics for treatment. Really, you're the Pandemic Therapeutic Institute, and thinking of therapeutics for prophylactic, and in the early stage, use that as to, if not prevent, at least dampen the transmission.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting and important point, Linfa. And just for people that don't know a lot about using antivirals to prevent infection, Linfa is referring to something called PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis. So that's antivirals that someone who is at risk of HIV can take, and it reduces their chance of becoming infected. And when that first started, now about 10, 12 years ago, it was oral antivirals. And then over the last 5 years, they've developed, mainly companies, injectable antivirals. So you can have an injection now once every 6 months that reduces your chance of getting HIV by 99%, quite extraordinary. But the tricky thing about prevention is it's got to be cheap and it's got to be very non-toxic, because you want healthy people to be taking it. But ideally, that's exactly what would make a very big difference. And right now in DRC, there's an outbreak of Ebola, which they've used exactly that approach to protect people at risk. And that's really a fantastic intervention.
And we've seen that with STIs, right? Sexually transmitted infections, too, using doxycycline as post-exposure prophylaxis. So lots of different ways to think about it. I actually want to take a step back and say we've been talking about vaccines and therapeutics, but to know that we have to combat an epidemic or a pandemic, we have to know that it's happening first. So let's talk about surveillance. I report on the CDC, the US CDC, and the WHO. And as you may all know, the World Health Organization's funding's been cut. It's reorganized. I've heard as high as 40% of people are leaving the organization, and the WHO does a lot of global surveillance. The CDC has also been really cut down, hugely, lost about a third of its staff. And at the moment, the US government is in a shutdown, which means there's very little surveillance happening of things like bird flu or other things. So can you talk a bit about what surveillance looks like in this new global landscape where two of the largest public health agencies are crippled, really?
Well, the blame is obviously laid on the U.S., but I'm not to blame. I think you know who to blame.
We must speak for all of America here.
Yes, unfortunately, I'm in that position. I think it's sad. I think it's reflected in my earlier comments, and it's a disaster, and it's going to impact not just the U.S., the whole world, and certainly not for the better. I don't know what to do. I think, since such impactful decisions are made by one country but affecting the whole world, I think the U.S. election should be chosen by the entire world. It clearly would have a different outcome.
Interesting idea. I was thinking, though, what you said about immigrants, too, because with bird flu, for example, there are very few immigrants actually going to seek medical care because they're afraid of what might happen to them. So there's all different ways at which this is being affected. Professor Lewin, you want to say
Yeah,
something?
I was going to just comment about global influenza surveillance because the Doherty Institute is home to the WHO Collaborating Centre for Research and Reference in Influenza, and they're one of 5 centres around the world that do influenza surveillance, and we're the host, and our centre is the only centre in the Southern Hemisphere. And our centre is actually funded by the Australian government, but the surveillance system is coordinated by the WHO. And the US, my understanding is that funding hasn't been cut yet, but the plan is to cut funding to WHO by 20%. However, the US government currently funds 50% of global flu surveillance, so it's going to have a huge effect on flu surveillance. And today in our meeting, we heard about all sorts of new flu strains that are moving in birds and poultry and cows, and lots happening in the US, and all that surveillance has wound down. Furthermore, the US CDC supports a lot. The infrastructure has been so good. Let's just, David's being very depressed about what's happening now, but we should also recognise how great the US has been on science and global health. And the US CDC does support many centres around the world from low middle income countries who don't have the capacity to do flu surveillance. So who's going to be supporting those people? So there's a lot of discussion now about who will step up, whether surveillance will change, whether we can do this without the US. But I think though that is really something governments need to worry about.
Yeah, I'll just continue with what Sharon just said. I think surveillance without US, it will be very different, right? The global, but for the next few years, we cannot stop. So what we do is to be, first is realistic, secondly is smarter, okay? So again, my personal experience, I sitting on many committees in WHO, CEPI and everything. So clearly people are saddened, as David said, but at the same time, we feel like we cannot stop. So in Singapore, we have been knocking on the doors. Basically, people basically says, Singapore government only really support program in ASEAN nations because we're part of that. So what we have been doing is to say, yes, we're willing to do it, but it's very hard to do as such a tiny nation doing it alone. So in the last 2 years, we have worked with UKRI, we have worked with Gates, and now we're trying to work with WHO and Wellcome. So in a small way, we're filling that gap, not the whole gap, US left, but also now using the absolutely cutting edge technology to make sure we do smarter surveillance. And then the key is that we have to say data sharing is very important. Ownership belongs to the country, but you have to share. So we're doing a small way, but I think in this difficult time, as I said, stop is not the choice, but we have to do it in regional and also smart. Yeah.
I should say, I think a little bit different things. I think for this PRA meeting, I think it's very useful. And then we just 4 countries, right?
Mm-hmm.
5.
Yeah, the regions here.
Yes, join together. And then after 3 years, close to 4 years, we make a lot of progress. And each conference, after each conference, we got a lot of idea, and then we develop ourselves. So thinking something is useful to that. So this is some not small way. It's getting bigger and bigger. So in at the very beginning, I think so that would put some political issue inside that. We don't like that. It's should be avoided. So the cooperation in between scientists and physicians and all the things is easier for us. We don't have any border and obstacle. So far, getting out from now on, I think we are very happy to join together. I probably think this is the time to expand our organization. So to get more people, and then from the society point, from the scientific point of view, we can join together to work out this. So not always through the government. Of course, the government will make some decision, but it's not all will be decided by the government. So this is something I think at the moment. So after 3 years, PRA, so our commitment, so all the things seems to be working very well. So this is what I think with that.
Well, thank you both for that, because I was starting to get very depressed here. So let's talk about, if governments do step away, are there things that academia can do, private industries can do, philanthropy can do? What are the ways in which those can all step in and sort of bridge the gap a bit?
Don't always asking David. So I just try to answer a little bit. So actually, I think, so this is something you mentioned about. I think so during, at the beginning of COVID, there are a lot of criticized to the WHO, their action or all the things, and try to organize an independent panel of pandemic prepare response, the so-called IPPPR. So in September of 2021. So that need some scientists and experts come in. I think it's altogether will be 14 people coming, and they have no any official title. So that's trying to be make some judgment more objectively. So I was one of that. It's led by Helen Clark.
Yeah, Helen.
Helen Clark and Sirleaf, two of them. We spent about 9 months to work our report and see, well, we should do that. So what's the gap to prepare of such a big, huge pandemic and cause such a big impact of the society and economy. So we should do this, we should prepare that. So the next disease, they are not calling next disease. Nobody knows what next disease was. So how to prepare. That's a report, very thick one. When it published, I think in 20, I think 9 months, 22, is that something?
2022,
May.
yeah.
Yes.
20
yes.
May. I think there's no any administrative power at that time. So just the agreement with the scientists and so on. So we need to do that. At that time I mentioned I was worried about whether this can put into practice. So eventually, after 2 or 3 months, of course, WHO have make a great effort and partly put into practice, but not too much. So that's fortunately, I think the World Health Assembly set up a pandemic agreement. So that's this year in May, I think. That's useful. That's the firstly, the so-called, to put it in legal binding. So collective commitment to the future pandemic. I think that will be okay. I'll make a great effort to make a step, but just a document and promise. We need all the countries sign this agreement. I think, I don't know how many countries have signed it. In China had already signed it. You should do that. So responsibility, and then to avoid so equally, and this is something sharing the. So this is something I hope will be the right way for that. So we need to get some to support the WHO's effort. That's what I think.
I didn't mean to be all gloom and doom. I think the U.S. government for the moment has clearly withdrawn, but the scientists have not.
No.
And the public health researchers have not. And so we're carrying on, and as you could see, we're trying to address not only HIV, but flu and, of course, COVID and other viral threats. But the issue is, if this goes on long enough, how are we going to sustain our efforts? And that is the big question mark. But for the moment, I think for the immediate future, we could keep going. And the dedication of the scientists has not altered. And so there is hope, and let's hope this this doesn't last.
Oh, Apoorva, you mentioned around other potential contributors than governments and academics, and the role of philanthropy has been very important in global health. There are many foundations who contribute substantially: the Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, Novo Nordisk Foundation. Many of those foundations have really stepped up in the recent changes. And of course, we've had extraordinary examples of individual gifts. The audience heard about Jeff's incredible gift as an individual, giving $250 million towards advancing the science behind pandemic therapeutics. So I think the private sector can also, the philanthropic sector can make a big difference too. But they can't do everything. We're seeing that now with all the changes from the US administration, particularly globally around HIV. The Gates Foundation can't step in and cover all of that.
Yeah, so Singapore is kind of very special, a small nation, a very, very strong government. So in Singapore, I think government will be the main driver, but we are working with industry and philanthropic, so sort of different organizations, both in Asia. Gates just set up an office in Singapore. And I just received email, they're very interested co-founding the pandemic science with my organization. So this is a partnership. So I think it varies between country to country, but overall, I think, certain regions are taking it much more seriously, and I'm fortunate I'm in a country that government, agency, everybody, and of course, the whole scientific community, yeah.
One thing I wanted to go back to COVID actually is the difference in access that many different countries had to the vaccines that were developed. And earlier, Professor Wang, you mentioned, the countries themselves would own the data, the surveillance, the genetic sequence, et cetera. And Professor Zhong, you were talking about the pandemic treaty, which for people who may not know, that treaty was accepted. There's a pandemic treaty in place. There's international health regulations, but the very key piece of that, the pathogen exchange system, is basically a quid pro quo thing. If we give you the sequence, you give us access to vaccines. That has not passed. So how should we think about that? Do you think it's possible that countries will actually come to a place where they agree to that kind of treatment? It seems like that's been the biggest sticking point, and many people that I've spoken to have said they don't see at least the low and middle income countries really agreeing to giving up their intellectual property without really sort of strict things in writing saying they will have access.
The principle is incredibly important. There's in a global health crisis, you cannot just have vaccines, therapeutics, and opportunities for rich countries and forget low and middle income countries. And I think we have to be creative in how to think about this, because when a drug company develops a drug, it takes a lot of money to develop it, so therefore they can and must charge a lot at the beginning until it's off patent. And it's reasonable, I think, that you can have differential pricing, exactly how HIV drugs work. They're expensive in high-income countries and they're cheap and generic in low-income countries. And the business model still works for pharma. So I still don't understand why we can't do something like that for pandemic therapeutics, for example. Vaccines overall are generally much cheaper, and there were initiatives to enhance the availability through WHO for vaccines globally. But a big issue was that many low and middle income countries didn't want to take them. And so capacity within continents like Africa are very important. Africa has developed a lot of capacity now for mRNA vaccination production and to produce their own vaccines. So I think a two-tiered pricing, we've got to work through this issue about pricing for high-income and low-middle-income countries. It can work, and it is working now for HIV.
The timing is key, right? I mean, HIV, yes, it is working with lenacapavir, the one you mentioned. There is an agreement now in place to get very low-cost alternatives to low- and middle-income countries, but not till 2027, which is still quite a way away. So how can you do that in the time frame that it would need to happen in a pandemic?
Well, I think the principles, this is why the pandemic agreement's so important, because the principles have to be agreed to in peacetime and in preparation for what happens, in a crisis like a pandemic.
Ideally, right, pandemic treaty is the first step. I think in parallel, we're arguing we should have a pandemic fund so that, to solve the issue, usually, not always, but usually is the index case from developing nations, and you isolate the virus, and you develop vaccine, and then you go back to charge them. So if you have a pandemic fund, you will guarantee the first few weeks, especially if we have the drug or whatever stockpiled, right? The international organization, the legal entity also has the money to say they will receive first. We will treat that rate to dampen the transmission, and eventually the rich countries will also benefit. I'm a positive person. I'm in my role, I'm trying to working toward that, a treaty plus a fund. That at least were the most urgent first few weeks or few months that you don't worry about the equality issue because it's free of charge. It comes to the index case area. That's, I think, it will be the future.
But now don't count on the U.S. contributing to that fund.
They haven't signed the treaty yet.
I know.
We're going to go it alone.
Yeah.
I think looking back to the last century, I think, of course, HIV, David had contributed a lot. Everybody knows you and in China. So treat the Magic Johnson, right? Everybody knows you. And still a latent patient or totally cured?
Yeah.
Not cured, controlled.
Control. Okay. I think the most important, looking back to the last century, just two pathogens will be most possibility to cause pandemic. One is so-called the auto-missile bacteria. That means influenza. And the other is coronavirus. So 3 times in this century. So 2003, 2012, MERS, and 2019, all coronavirus. So we should pay more attention to these two kind of pathogens. So I think why it will cause pandemic. So that's human-to-human transmission in different way, but most unavoidable way is via breathing air. So that's unavoidable. The others to avoid contact or food and some other mosquito and some other tick, some others will be easier. That's cause some epidemic. Those who cause pandemic, the majority, probably all the disease or transmit by breathing. So this is a respiratory disease as the most important disease, infectious disease to cause pandemic.
And most likely flu, right? That's what people always
Flu is the same. So the flu, some mutation flu, a mixed mutation with cow, cattle, poultry, and human. Mutation of the 3 mixed gene, the cause, and swine flu in 2009. It's huge. So I think if once we meet this kind of pathogen, we'll pay more attention to that. So they will give some intervention as early as possible. As a chest physician, I think I experienced this 2 times of COVID. So it needs some time to see if it is really will cause pandemic. The first thing is transmit to human, and cause disease. And the second is human transmit to human by breathing. So this is unavoidable. So the others can avoid. So this is something we need. And then we cause death or some disease, severe disease. Now, like some others, chikungunya and some others, they happened in China, but that caused very mild symptoms, not caused mortality. So this is why if we are discussing and tackling about the pandemic, so two kinds of pathogens should pay more attention to. So this is why at the very beginning, I have noticed this kind of disease, it's human to human transmission. When I first announced in 21st and 2020, and then that this kind of disease has a human to human transmission. And then 2 or 3 days later, in Melbourne happened. So that's 2 or 3 days later, because a passenger, I don't know, he's Chinese or Australian,
Chinese
fly
from Wuhan.
from Guangzhou to Melbourne and cause spreading. So this is something, I think once we have met the coronavirus, no matter what kind of virus, or baculovirus or McCoven virus, that will pay more attention to this. So this is what we are aware about these kind of things.
Let me make a comment about therapeutics. I think at this conference today, we heard a lot about broadening our coverage with therapeutic, with perhaps unknown viruses in the known family, right? We're doing that with flu, with coronaviruses, and even hantavirus and others. But there could be an unknown threat. And what I have learned from the COVID experience is we are not taking advantage of our innate defenses. People know about antibodies and T cells, but those are secondary later responses. We have a frontline response, which we call innate responses. And we could try to find strategies to induce those innate responses via interferon pathways, and they are particularly good against the respiratory pathogens that Dr. Zhong just talked about, because we could apply them locally. And we have experience with glycolipids that were stimulated via the CD1D pathway and could protect against a variety of respiratory pathogens. There are approaches using agonists that would induce this so-called C-gas sting pathway, and we're not doing enough of that because those would broadly protect. It may not protect against all threats, but would have the potential to protect against many such threats. And that area, I think, I see a little bit of activity, but not enough.
Oh, I just follow up to say, I'm a strong believer that, instead of antiviral, it's anti-disease, without selling my field, but bats are doing that. They have all the viruses without disease. So I think David is right. Innate immunity is another area, huge potential to explore, because the bats carries all the viruses, but without disease. If we can do that, then I think you achieve a lot.
Yeah, I might jump in and put a dampener on it. I actually think it's really important. But actually, historically, the best antivirals we've had are direct-acting antivirals. So we actually treated hepatitis B and C for a long time with the approach of activating the innate immune response with interferon. But that approach was never as good as the antivirals. Having said that, in the early phase of respiratory infection, having something like this would be very important. We often call it a host target rather than a viral target. I agree it's been underexplored, but historically, the actually specific drugs have done better.
We're actually out of time. I was going to ask each of you to say something you're excited about very quickly, but I think, we've heard something very positive from Professor Ho, so it's a good opportunity to end the panel there on that note of optimism.
Yeah.
Please thank our panelists for a really lively discussion.